I woke up that morning to the aroma of coffee wafting through our quiet suburban home, the kind of place where you'd assume nothing ever goes wrong. My name is Marcus Reynolds, and I'm a software engineer. I'm skilled at my job, reliable and dependable. It's been enough to provide a comfortable life for me, my wife Linda, and our 17-year-old son, Caleb. Our house is modest but cozy, with a large oak tree in the front yard, and a backyard where Caleb used to kick around a soccer ball when he was younger. On the surface, everything seemed peaceful, like one of those perfect family portraits you'd see in a store frame. But inside, well, that's a different story. Linda and I had been married for almost 2 decades, and whatever love we began with had faded into something cold and distant. We stayed together for Caleb, though our son was the glue holding this shaky structure together. That morning, I was seated at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee and scrolling through emails on my laptop. Caleb sat across from me, eating a bowl of cereal. His dark hair fell into his eyes as he focused on his phone. He's a quiet kid, thoughtful, with a mind full of music and stories, things Linda never quite understood. She was in the next room, getting ready for work. Linda works in finance and always prides herself on managing money better than anyone else, especially me. She'd remind me of it whenever she could, as if it were some kind of trophy she'd won. I rarely argued anymore. It wasn't worth the battle. Then her phone rang, sharp and loud, shattering the morning calm. I looked up as she answered, her voice instantly brightening when she realized who it was. Rachel. Hey, how's everything? She put the call on speaker, as she always did when her sister called. Rachel's voice echoed through the kitchen, cheerful and lively. April just earned another academic award. Mom and Dad are thrilled. I noticed Linda's chest swell with pride, even though it wasn't her child who'd achieved anything. April is Rachel's daughter, our niece, and she's always been a golden child in the family. Straight A's, perfect test scores, the whole package. Linda responded as if April's successes were her own, as if she'd somehow played a part in raising her. Caleb didn't say a word, just kept eating his cereal. But I caught the way his shoulders slumped slightly. He was used to this by now. Linda comparing him to April, making him feel like he didn't measure up. I hated it. My son has talent, real talent, just not the kind Linda values. He writes songs on his guitar late at night, and I've read some of his writing. It's deep, moving, and full of emotion. But to Linda, if it's not about grades or money, it doesn't matter. I gave him a small smile across the table, trying to silently say, I see you. I'm proud of you. He glanced back at me, his eyes softening a little, and I knew he understood. Rachel kept talking, her voice buzzing through the speaker. Oh, and by the way, Mom and Dad want to have dinner soon to celebrate April's award. They also mentioned we discuss some important financial matters. My stomach churned the moment I heard financial matters. With Linda's family, that phrase never meant anything good. They were the kind of people who would sit around a table and plot how to squeeze every last penny out of a situation, especially if it meant outshining someone else. Linda was smirking, already imagining whatever plan they were concocting. But I could sense it coming, a problem brewing like a storm on the horizon. I set my coffee mug down a little harder than I intended, the clink loud enough to make Caleb look up at me. You okay, Dad? He asked softly. I nodded, forcing a smile. Yeah, Bud. Just thinking. Linda hung up the phone and walked into the kitchen, her heels clicking sharply on the tile floor. She didn't even glance at me, just poured herself a cup of coffee, as if everything was fine. Rachel says April's going to some fancy award ceremony next week, she said, her tone dripping with satisfaction. Isn't that wonderful? I didn't respond immediately, just watched her. She didn't notice Caleb sitting there, didn't see the way he stared down at his bowl, wishing he could vanish into it. Yeah, I said finally, my voice flat. Really amazing. Linda shot me a look, but I didn't care. I knew something was wrong, something bigger than just another family dinner. And whatever it was, I had a sinking feeling it was about to hit us hard. I locked the door and turned to face them, crossing my arms. Guess this couldn't wait, I said, leaning against the wall. Linda walked down the stairs, her hair pulled back tightly, her eyes still burning with the anger from last night. She must have called him over, set up this little ambush while I was asleep. She stood next to her mother, arms crossed, mirroring me as if we were squaring off. "That money belongs to April," Margaret growled, her voice sharp and stern, like she was scolding a child. I raised an eyebrow, keeping my cool even though I could feel my temper simmering beneath the surface. "No," I said slowly and clearly. "It belongs to Caleb. Always has." Rachel stepped forward, slamming a thick folder onto the coffee table with a loud thud. "We consulted lawyers," she said, her tone oozing confidence. "You had no right to move that money, Marcus. It's not legal." I glanced at the folder, then picked it up, flipping through the pages. It was filled with legal jargon and a few highlighted lines, but nothing that seemed particularly solid. I chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that made Rachel's smirk falter. "This is pointless," I said, tossing it back onto the table. "The funds are in a trust, locked up tight. Everything was done by the book years ago. You've got no case." Linda's fingers clenched, and I could see her jaw tighten. But I didn't flinch. I'd known they'd try something like this. Someday. And I'd made absolutely sure they couldn't touch it. Ed adjusted his glasses, staring at me like I was some puzzle he could solve. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he said, his tone sharp. "Keeping it behind our backs, acting like you're better than us." I shrugged, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I don't think I'm clever," I replied. "I just know my son deserves his chance, and I wasn't going to let you take it from him." Margaret gasped, clutching her purse as if I'd insulted her entire family legacy. "We were trying to do what's best," she said. "April has a real future. Colleges are fighting over her. Caleb, well, he's my son." I interrupted, my voice firm now. "And he has a future, too. You don't get to decide his is worth less than hers." Linda finally spoke, her voice low and tense. "We'll see about that," she said, stepping closer. "You think you've won, Marcus, but I'm not done. I'll find a way." I stared at her, really looked at her, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for her. She was so consumed with winning, with proving she was right, that she didn't even realize what she was losing. "Yes," I said, nodding slowly. "We will." My response caught her off guard. I could tell she'd expected me to argue, to shout, but I wasn't giving her the fight she wanted. "Not yet." Rachel picked up the folder, clutching it to her chest as if it still held some value. "This isn't over," she said, echoing Linda, though her voice sounded less confident now. I didn't bother replying, just watched as Ed and Margaret exchanged a glance. One of those tense, uneasy looks they often shared when things didn't go their way. "We'll be in touch," Ed added, as if it were some grand threat. Then they turned to leave, filing out the door with Linda trailing behind. She shot me one last look before stepping outside, and a minute later, I heard their car start up, the engine fading as they drove away. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle back in. Then I walked to the kitchen and grabbed my coffee again. It was cold now, but I drank it anyway, leaning against the counter. Upstairs, I heard Caleb's door creak open, and his footsteps came quietly down the stairs. He peeked into the kitchen, his hair messy from sleep, his eyes wide. "Was that Grandma and Grandpa?" he asked. I nodded, setting my mug down. "Yeah," I said. "They're not happy, but it's okay. Nothing's changing." He bit his lip, looking at the floor. "They're really upset, huh?" "Yeah," I said, walking over and placing a hand on his shoulder. "They can be mad all they want. You're still going to college. That's what matters." He looked up at me, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Thanks, Dad," he said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. I smiled back, ruffling his hair a little. "Go have some breakfast," I said. "We got a day to get through." He nodded and headed to the fridge, and I watched him for a moment, feeling a quiet pride wash over me. Linda and her family could throw whatever they wanted at us. Lawyers, threats, guilt trips. But I'd set up that trust for Caleb, solid as a rock. They weren't getting through it. Not today. Not ever. I finished my coffee and washed the mug, ready for whatever came next.